A large European majority wants peace. Yet that desire is not translated into policy in large measure because those governments' subversion of democratic processes. No, this is not a quote from Vladimir Putin. It comes from the newly released US National Security Strategy, a document intended to define the threats facing the United States and the methods by which the president's administration plans to address them. This is the first serious attempt to crystallize the concept of America First, and to explain what it actually means for US foreign policy, for America's allies, and for its adversaries. The new strategy portrays a world fundamentally hostile to the United States. A world that for decades enriched itself by exploiting the naivety and idealism of liberal elites, who once governed America. President Trump now intends to bring that era to an end, and to do so in a radically uncompromising way. Unlike during his first term, Trump is no longer trying to repair the existing international order. This time he seeks to tear it down and build a new one on its ruins. He challenges virtually everything that has formed the foundations of US strategy for decades: globalism and free trade, America's role in international institutions, and even the logic of maintaining alliances that fail to deliver tangible benefits to the United States. The new strategy is brutally honest, as it states, not every country, region, issue or cause, however worthy, can be the focus of American strategy. America is officially abandoning the export of liberal democracy and relinquishing its role as the world's policeman. In Trump's America, there is no room for sentiment. From now on, the sole compass of US foreign policy is American national interest. This does not mean retreat from global power. Quite the opposite. The United States intends to preserve its position as the world's hegemon, but through far more ruthless, Machiavellian methods. What follows is a geopolitical earthquake, a sweeping reconfiguration of alliances and rivalries alike. In Washington's new strategy, China remains an existential adversary. Russia, by contrast, is recast as a potential partner. The European Union, meanwhile, is treated as a political and economic rival, whose bureaucratic structures should be dismantled as quickly as possible. We are entering an era of unrestrained competition, in which the United States has pulled all its assets on the table: dollar hegemony, technological superiority, and the full arsenal of economic warfare, not only to strike at enemies, but also to discipline defiant allies. Welcome to Donald Trump's world. The new US national security strategy makes one thing clear. The world is entering an era of hard, interest-driven competition. Alliances are becoming conditional. Globalization is being questioned, and economic warfare through sanctions, financial pressure, and technological controls is turning into a standard tool of state policy. In this environment, political decisions translate into market movements faster than ever, affecting currencies, commodities, and entire sectors of the global economy. That is why understanding the world through an economic lens has become essential. One of the tools that helps with that is XTB, an investment platform I use to track global trends and respond to change based on data rather than emotion. With XTB you get access to over 8,400 stocks and ETFs from markets around the world, commission-free up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover. Above that, a standard 0.2% fee applies. The link is in the description, and by using it you support this channel. As always, remember that investing involves risk. The central axis of the new American strategy is the concept of national interest. As the document states plainly, the purpose of foreign policy is the protection of core national interests. That is the sole focus of this strategy. The Trump administration delivers a sharp indictment of the foreign policy pursued for decades by America's liberal elites. Those elites, it argues, convinced citizens that promoting democracy abroad and fighting costly distant wars, particularly in the Middle East, served America's national interest. According to Trump, this was a profound falsehood. It led to the overextension of the American empire and the gradual depletion of its resources. Trump locates the roots of America's crisis above all in the promotion of globalism and free trade, and in the excessive entanglement of US foreign policy with international institutions, such as the United Nations. The new strategy argues it was the mechanisms of free trade that led to the dismantling of America's industrial base, the erosion of the middle class, and the growing dependence of the United States on supply chains controlled by its rivals. Globalization is no longer presented as an opportunity, but as a vehicle for transferring wealth out of the United States, primarily to China. A similar reassessment applies to international organizations, which were originally intended to serve as a force multipliers and reinforce America's global dominance. In practice, however, they have proven to be instruments that constrain Washington and limit its ability to conduct a flexible foreign policy. The Trump administration seeks a clean break from the legacy of its predecessors, an end to liberal interventionism, and a fundamental redefinition of what American national interest actually means. Where Trump's predecessors defined national interest as the defense of the liberal world order, Trump defines it far more narrowly, as the security of the United States itself. The entire new strategy is subordinated to this single priority. Crucially, however, security is understood in very broad terms. It does not refer solely to physical protection against military threats, such as a hostile invasion of US territory. It also includes protection against hostile trade practices, foreign influence operations, drug cartels and trafficking networks, mass immigration, and even the defense of civilizational identity. This allows us to identify three core components of US security: military, economic, and civilizational. Defined this way, security carries profound implications for American foreign policy. In Donald Trump's world, a trade deficit is not merely a macroeconomic indicator whose significance depends on other variables. It is a symptom of strategic weakness, comparable to the loss of territory. A trade deficit represents a transfer of American national power to its rivals, and one that must be corrected as quickly as possible. In Trump's worldview, reindustrialization of the United States ceases to be merely an economic objective and becomes, above all, a matter of national security. America must be able to produce everything, from steel and ammunition to the most advanced semiconductor chips, in order to shield itself from economic coercion by states that control critical supply chains. This uncompromising approach and the broader securitization of policy is clearly reflected in Trump's pressure to strengthen the US energy sector. The new strategy fully rejects the climate policies of recent decades, dismissing both climate change and the net zero agenda as a quote harmful ideology that has benefited only America's adversaries. As a result, traditional fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, along with nuclear energy, regain their status as strategic resources meant to provide cheap and reliable power for America's reindustrializing economy. At the same time, exports of US energy resources, particularly LNG, are elevated to the level of strategic lever. Energy exports are intended to secure American energy dominance, displace rival powers from key markets, and bind the economies of partner states, especially in Europe, more tightly to the United States. The new American strategy also places enormous emphasis on what it defines as the country's civilizational security. The Trump administration argues that if the American empire is to endure, it must be strong not only militarily and economically, but also spiritually. Trump seeks to protect what he calls the strength of the American spirit through several channels, foremost among them a decisive break with mass immigration. Not only illegal, but mass immigration as such, which in his view has overwhelmed the United States. The president argues that mass immigration has strained national resources, increased crime, weakened social cohesion, distorted labor markets, and undermined national security. The new strategy therefore treats mass migration as a form of external invasion. Border protection and the prevention of further migration waves are elevated to the rank of absolute priorities. Trump also identifies a threat to America's civilizational strength in radical forms of social engineering and ideological activism, including woke ideology and DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion. In his view, these currents hollow out society from within, penetrating every sphere of American life, from schools and workplaces to the military and politics, and leaving the nation vulnerable to what the strategy describes as cultural subversion, a weakness that America's adversaries can readily exploit. In this sense, the new strategy also signals a conservative cultural counter-revolution, grounded in the defense of traditional values. For Trump, the overriding priority is the security of the United States, a security he is prepared to guarantee at any cost. There are no fixed rules. The ends justify the means. In the new strategy, this approach is described as flexible realism. Trump seeks a foreign policy guided exclusively by American national interest, not by the promotion of democratic values or human rights. US diplomats are expected to negotiate, strike deals, and strengthen the empire, not to deliver more lectures about the superiority of the democratic world over other systems. Under the new strategy, the United States is ready to cooperate with any state, whether a democracy, a military dictatorship, or an absolute monarchy. The political system of a given country is of no importance to Trump. What matters, and matters alone, is whether cooperation serves the national interest of the United States. Trump therefore embraces pure transactionalism. In his worldview, political and military alliances are not rooted in shared values, but function as business contracts with clearly defined terms, valid only as long as they serve America's interests. Unlike in previous decades, America's partners are no longer those who share liberal values, but those who are solvent and, above all, useful to the United States. The most striking expression of this transactional approach is Trump's attitude toward NATO. During his first term, he repeatedly criticized alliance members for relying on the American security umbrella while failing to develop their own defense capabilities. As a result of this pressure, and accelerated by the war in Ukraine, European NATO members gradually increased defense spending. At the NATO summit in The Hague in June 2025, they went so far as to agree to allocate 5% of GDP to defense. The new US strategy acknowledges this more balanced burden sharing as a positive development, but concludes that it is still insufficient. Trump wants America's allies to assume even greater responsibility for their own security. European NATO members are expected to take primary responsibility for the defense of the continent, freeing up US military resources for use in other regions of the world. Trump's objective is therefore no longer limited to a more balanced sharing of responsibilities, burden sharing, but extends to a far more ambitious goal, burden shifting onto America's allies. Washington appears to recognize that this approach could generate serious tensions within NATO. To manage this risk, the strategy proposes the creation of what it calls burden-sharing networks, groupings of states willing to assume greater responsibility for the defense of specific regions. Within these networks, the United States would act primarily as a coordinator, rather than the principal guarantor and financier of security. To incentivize allies to take on the role of regional security providers, Washington offers a menu of benefits. States prepared to shoulder greater responsibility can expect preferential trade terms with the United States, easier access to American weapons systems, and privileged entry into US technological ecosystems. These policies carry potentially far-reaching consequences. NATO increasingly shifts from an alliance of shared values toward a paid security service. At the same time, there is a growing risk of dividing NATO members into two tiers, with only Washington's top performers enjoying preferential treatment and access. The new strategy identifies 5 regions, for which it outlines a more detailed vision of future US foreign policy: the Western Hemisphere, the Indo-Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. With regard to the Western Hemisphere, traditionally regarded by Washington as its exclusive sphere of influence, the new strategy announces a return to first principles, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. In its original form, the Monroe Doctrine declared that the American continents were no longer open to colonization or political interference by European powers, and that any such attempt would be treated as a hostile act against the United States. The new strategy updates this doctrine through what it terms the Trump corollary. Under this revised framework, contemporary external powers, above all China but also Russia and Iran, are to be pushed out of the Western Hemisphere. These states are not to maintain military bases in the region, nor to control ports or other critical infrastructure. Excessive economic cooperation between them and countries of the Western Hemisphere is also viewed with suspicion. Venezuela under President Nicolas Maduro has effectively become a testing ground for the implementation of the Trump corollary. US strategy toward the Western Hemisphere is encapsulated in the slogan "Enlist and Expand." Washington seeks to enlist its old friends to advance American objectives in the region, particularly migration control and the fight against drug trafficking. At the same time, the United States plans a broad diplomatic and economic offensive designed to systematically displace competitors and draw additional countries into the US orbit. The threats America faces in the Western Hemisphere, however, are not limited to competition with China or Russia. The strategy also highlights asymmetric and hybrid threats, most notably mass migration and drug trafficking into the United States. Trump intends to confront these challenges aggressively by redeploying resources from low-priority regions to the Western Hemisphere. An expanded military presence on land and at sea is intended to curb migration flows and deliver decisive results in the war against drug cartels, a campaign that the Trump administration has elevated into an entirely new level. Individual cartels are being designated as foreign terrorist organizations, placing them in the same legal category as groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. This reclassification allows Trump to deploy not only law enforcement agencies like the DEA, but also the full power of the US military, a shift already visible in operations such as strikes against Venezuelan vessels engaged in drug smuggling. Washington's long-term objective, however, is above all deep economic integration of the Western Hemisphere with the United States through nearshoring, the relocation of American production from Asia closer to US borders. The Western Hemisphere is thus meant to function as a secure resource base and manufacturing hub for the American empire. Another region of critical strategic importance for the United States is the Indo-Pacific, which the new strategy identifies as the key theater of competition in the 21st century. The document notes that the Indo-Pacific accounts for nearly half of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms. Trump argues that if the US economy is to thrive, it must also successfully compete for economic and political influence in this region. On the economic front, the new strategy rejects the long-standing dogma that trade with China would eventually lead to political liberalization. Washington now seeks to reduce its own economic exposure to China while simultaneously leveraging its partners to exert pressure on Beijing. Specifically, the United States intends to push Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia and others to adopt policies that would force China to curb its aggressive export-driven model and redirect production toward its domestic market. The front line in competition with China is also being extended to the global south. The strategy correctly observes that China has tied many developing countries to itself through infrastructure loans. Washington plans a counteroffensive. It aims to mobilize massive financial assets held by partners in Europe and Asia, estimated at $7 trillion, in order to offer poorer countries an alternative to Chinese capital. Washington's logic is explicit. The long-term preservation of economic and technological primacy is the most reliable way to avoid a kinetic war with China. This implies sustained pressure on allies to cut China off from advanced technologies, including semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. To that end, the United States seeks to build an informal technological alliance, in which access to American capital markets and innovation is offered as a reward for political alignment and the economic isolation of Beijing. On the military side, the new strategy underscores the necessity of defending Taiwan against Chinese aggression. For the Trump administration, Taiwan's strategic value lies not only in its dominance of semiconductor manufacturing, but above all in its role in maintaining control over the first island chain, the arc stretching from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines. This chain forms a natural barrier preventing China's navy from breaking out into the deep waters of the Pacific. Should Taiwan fall, the entire American strategy toward the region would collapse, opening a direct path for China toward Guam and Hawaii. At the same time, the United States expects its Asian allies, Japan and South Korea, to assume greater responsibility for the defense of the region. Once again, the new strategy returns to the issue of burden sharing. Asian allies are expected to expand their conventional defense capabilities and actively reinforce the first island chain. Moreover, the price of the American security umbrella is rising. Washington now demands not only higher defense spending, but also broader access for the US Navy to allied ports and military bases. The arrangement is straightforward. Allies are to build a wall along the first island chain, while the United States provides the strategic depth and the striking power necessary to prevail in a confrontation with China, should war prove unavoidable. The section of the new strategy devoted to Europe is titled Promoting European Greatness, and it is likely the most controversial part of the entire document. It amounts to a sharp indictment of Europe's political elites and openly calls into question the future of the transatlantic relationship. The strategy notes that Europe's share of global GDP has fallen from 25% in 1990 to around 14% today, blaming excessive regulation and EU bureaucracy for this decline. Yet, for the Trump administration, Europe's primary threat is not economic stagnation, but the prospect of, quote, civilizational erasure. Washington accuses the European Union of undermining democratic principles, repressing political opposition, eroding national identities, and promoting mass migration, a process that, in the strategy's view, is leading to the demographic and cultural displacement of Europe's native populations by immigrants from outside the Western civilizational sphere. As the document puts it bluntly, quote, "We want Europe to remain European." In this framing, Brussels elites are no longer seen as allies, but as saboteurs undermining the old continent from within. The new US strategy therefore signals an active campaign against EU elites and what it describes as anti-democratic restrictions. It suggests that further European integration should be halted, and that the European Union itself should ultimately be dismantled. Washington indicates its willingness to actively support this process by backing so-called patriotic European parties, which seek a revival of sovereign nation-states at the expense of deeper European integration. In practice, this amounts to a classic divide-and-rule strategy. The United States intends to work closely with a select group of countries described as the healthy nations of Central, Eastern and Southern Europe. These are states which, in Trump's view, seek to preserve national identity and remain skeptical of mass migration and Brussels-driven centralization. With them, Washington aims to deepen both trade and military ties. Poland, for example, is portrayed in this framework as a key element of Europe's so-called healthy core. For Warsaw, this may appear an attractive prospect, but it becomes deeply misleading once US policy toward Russia is taken into account. The new US strategy criticizes European governments for what it calls unrealistic expectations regarding the war in Ukraine and largely ignores the fact that many European states view Russia as an existential threat. Washington's priority is a rapid end to the fighting in Ukraine, aimed at, quote, re-establishing strategic stability with Russia. This strongly suggests that Washington is still contemplating a version of a reversed Nixon maneuver, an attempt to detach Russia from China and pivot it against Beijing. That's not all. The new strategy effectively closes the door to NATO membership not only for Ukraine, but also for countries such as Georgia. The United States openly abandons the policy of further NATO expansion. It is worth noting that the Europe section is an exception in the overall architecture of the new US strategy. Toward the rest of the world, Washington proclaims a policy of flexible realism and cold transactionalism. Toward the European Union, however, it applies a fundamentally different logic, one grounded in explicitly ideological arguments. Why? The motives behind Washington's aggressive posture toward the EU appear twofold. On one level, the Trump administration views the European Union as the last major bastion of globalism in the Western world. At the same time, the United States still feels strong cultural ties to Europe and claims to care about the continent's future. More important, however, are hard imperial calculations. The EU, as a unified and powerful trading bloc, is a direct competitor to the United States. It imposes extensive regulations on American technology giants and stands in the way of Washington's attempt to dismantle the existing global order. A Europe fragmented into a loose confederation of sovereign nations would be far more convenient and far easier for Washington to manage. The new US strategy also introduces a revised vision for the Middle East. As a net energy exporter, the United States no longer needs to prioritize the region as it once did, when it was a critical source of resources for the American economy. As a result, Washington abandons the export of democracy to the Middle East and seeks to structure its relations with regional states, especially the Gulf monarchies, on a strictly transactional basis. The future of US engagement in the region is no longer tied primarily to oil, but to investments in nuclear energy, defense industries, and artificial intelligence. In the security domain, the new regional architecture is built above all around the expansion of the Abraham Accords, drawing additional Muslim-majority states into a US-backed framework of stability. The new national security strategy marks the moment when Washington removes the mask of the benevolent hegemon. If the post-war international order resembled the Roman Principate, a system in which the strongest power ruled while maintaining the appearance of partnership, presenting itself as primus inter pares, first among equals, then the new US strategy announces the arrival of modern dominata. The hegemon no longer pretends to be first among equals. It openly assumes the role of an absolute ruler. An even more precise analogy can be found in the history of the Delian League. Originally, it was an ancient defensive alliance of Greek city-states formed to counter Persia. It maintained a common treasury on the neutral island of Delos. Over time, however, the League evolved into an instrument of Athenian domination, and the treasury itself was transferred to Athens. What began as voluntary contributions for collective defense became compulsory tribute, serving less the common good than the expansion of Athenian power. A similar transformation is now underway under the Trump administration, forcing allies to spend 5% of GDP on defense, with a substantial share directed toward purchases from the United States, combined with American financial and technological dominance, amounts to a contemporary equivalent of moving the treasury to Washington. These massive transfers are no longer meant to sustain an abstract Western community in which liberal elites once believed. They are designed to finance the reindustrialization of the United States and to preserve the American empire. In this new reality, NATO evolves from an alliance of equals into a vassal arrangement. The burden of fighting along the empire's frontiers is shifted onto the shoulders of border states, while the United States retreats into the role of a commander directing operations from afar. The new strategy definitively buries the myth of the end of history. America no longer seeks to save, repair, or democratize the world. It promises no justice. It promises only this: under Trump, the United States will survive as an independent, sovereign republic, and it will prevail on its own uncompromising terms, funded in part by the resources of its allies.